Hi everyone, Ashley here and welcome to another video on the Penguin Palace Stamps YouTube channel. Today I'm sharing how I made these two coordinating cards using the new Stencils 360 system and the Sacred Lotus Stencil, which is actually a set of 3 separate stencils that work really nicely together, but for these two cards I'm actually just using one stencil, just one part of that set. So without further ado, let's get into it. Like I mentioned, I'm using the Stencils 360 system for this, and this is the start of that system. So this is a Stencils 360 base, which I've just taped down to my work surface here, and you can see it's just a square piece of plastic with a circular cutout. I'm starting by putting in a large piece of paper, so I'm using the 7.5 inch paper positioner, which is just that clear piece that I've dropped into the middle, and it has a square opening where I can line up this giant piece of paper. And the reason that I'm using such a big piece of paper is that I'm actually planning to make 2 cards out of the same pattern. So, and you'll see what I mean by that when we get a little bit further into the video. So now I'm just inlaying the stencil guide, and this is the 8-inch guide ring because I'm going to be using the 8-inch stencil from that Sacred Lotus stencil set. And here it is. So at the top of that stencil you can see there's a little heart, which shows you that you should be rotating that stencil to every heart indication on the Stencils 360 base. So I'm starting by keeping that heart pointing upwards to that very top notch of where that heart is on the Stencils 360 base, and I'll rotate it around as I go. So I'm starting by blending a light blue color. This is Speckled Egg Distress Oxide ink. And I'm just blending it onto both sort of leaves of that Sacred Lotus, the top and the bottom. And then I'll rotate that stencil so that I'm rotating it clockwise to the next heart notch on the Stencils 360 base. And I wanted it to be alternating light and dark, so once I've got that stencil in place, sort of rotated around to the next heart, I'll then take my dark blue Distress Oxide ink, this is Chipped Sapphire, and just blend that right on. And I didn't even bother to clean the stencil in between because I figured they're both blue, so if they blend into each other a little bit, it's fine. So now I'm rotating the stencil again, and I'll put it over to the next heart notch on that Stencils 360 base. So now you can see that the Sacred Lotus leaf is rotated one kind of step further. And now I'm just blending that light color on, so just alternating like I mentioned. I decided that I wanted the dark blue to kind of be on top, rather than sort of half on top, half beneath the light. So I'm just putting that stencil back to where the dark had been blended, and I'm just blending it again. And you'll see when I lift that off, now it looks like that dark blue leaf is on top of the light blue ones. So this is an example of how you can kind of use that stencil to kind of go back and forth, and you can pick and choose which sort of elements of the stencil pattern you want to be on top and which you want to be on bottom. And you can really easily do that by just kind of blending over top again of the images that you want to be more on top. So I'm doing this again, and I skipped a rotation because I know that I want to do some embossing, but I figured I would want to be doing the embossing at the very end once I've done all the rest of the pattern, so I skipped over the rotation where I want to do embossing, and I'm just filling in the rest of the inking. For this part of the pattern, I just did the 2 light blue inkings first, and now I'm coming back in for that middle dark blue inking. And this time I don't have to do it twice because it's being blended last, so it will show up on top. So it'll kind of match that first set of the pattern that I did. So there you have it. And as you can see, I've left 2 separate notches of rotation empty, and this is where I'm going to be doing the embossing. So I'm starting the embossing process by rubbing the entire panel with my anti-static tool. And then I can put the stencil back into that notch where the opening is that it needs to be. So just going over to that 4th heart rotation. And then I'm coming in with my Versamark ink and just pressing that ink pad right down onto those openings. So you don't even really need a blending tool for this. You can just press the ink pad right down. And in doing this, I did come up with a couple tips that I would suggest to you if you do also want to do some embossing when using the Stencils 360 system. The first tip is to leave the embossing to last, because once you put on this Versamark ink, you will kind of go right ahead, do the embossing, and then it might make it difficult to come back and do more inking on top of that. So you kind of want the embossing to be the last thing, because then it'll sort of be on the top of the pattern. The second tip is to kind of give a little bit of time for your distress inked pattern beneath to dry before you come back in for the embossing. And I guess this is really only if you are using that distress ink or distress oxide ink to do your blending for the stenciled pattern, because I do find that distress ink and distress oxide ink are rather wet inks. So if you went straight from that blending to embossing, a lot of your embossing powder would probably stick to the Distress ink rather than to just where you had put the Versamark ink. It's a good idea to let that Distress oxide or Distress ink dry first so that the embossing powder doesn't stick to it. So once I've put my silver embossing powder onto those parts of the pattern, I can come in with my heat tool and melt it all so that it becomes beautiful and metallic and shiny and gorgeous. And I thought that the silver would accent these light blue and dark blue colors really nicely, and it kind of gives a bit of a wintry floral vibe, which I really like. So I'm just finishing off melting that last bit of the embossing powder, and then the whole pattern is done. So like I mentioned, I did leave that Distress Oxide stenciled pattern to dry a little bit first, and then I did the embossing last, and that is how I got this result, and I think it's really pretty, and I like the idea of embossing with the Stencils 360. It's really fun. Okay, so like I mentioned, I wanted to get 2 cards out of that giant pattern. So I just cut the whole pattern right down the middle, and then I can use this rectangle die from Penguin Palace Stamps. This is the Dots Meet Stashes rectangle die in the second largest size that it comes in. So the whole panel cut out with this die measures 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. So it will leave you with enough space for a border if used on a standard size card. So once you've cut out both sides of that cut out pattern with the die, you get 2 identical pieces there. So the rest of the steps to put these cards together are quite simple. For both, I just picked out some sentiments from recently released Penguin Palace stamp sets and stamped them right on the panel in black ink. And I used black Versamark ink and my mini Misty tool to stamp them out because I wanted to stamp them a few times just to make sure I really got a crisp black image. So this first sentiment is "We're in this together," which is from the Heartfelt Notes stamp set. And on the second panel, I chose to use the sentiment "Heartfelt Thanks," which is another sentiment from that same Heartfelt Notes stamp set, which has a lot of really beautiful sentiments and some really gorgeous fonts. So I just stamped both of those sentiments kind of down towards the bottom right of the card panel, and then I picked out some card bases for them. For one of the cards, I picked out a light blue card base, and for the second card, I chose a dark blue card base, and I just thought that these would complement the colors on the cards quite nicely. For both cards, I also cut out a slightly smaller panel of silver foil cardstock, and I'm just gluing that right down to the card base. I thought this would be sort of a nice border for that panel because it is shiny and it brings in that silver embossing as sort of another accent color. So I'm just gluing down that silver panel onto the card front. And when I'm done that, I am going to add a piece of fun foam, which I've added double-sided tape to on both sides, right onto that silver cardstock and onto the back of the card panel. And this will kind of sandwich between the card base and the card panel and just add a little bit of dimension to the card panel, which I like to do on simple cards like this. It just adds a nice touch, I think. So once I've peeled back that release paper on the double-sided tape, I can just tape that card panel right down onto that silver piece of cardstock, and that card is pretty much complete. I'm going to do the same thing for the second card, where I glue down the silver cardstock and then tape down the card panel onto the whole card using some fun foam, and then both cards are pretty much done. The last thing I'm doing to finish these cards off is just adding some iridescent gems. So I've sort of just scattered them around the sentiment in a way that I feel like looks pretty nice, and I'm just using my tweezers to lift them up one at a time and then putting down a small dab of liquid glue to hold down those gems. And I'll just do that one by one until all the gems are glued down. And that is it. These cards came together super easily because I felt like the patterns were just so beautiful and striking on their own that I didn't want to overdo it with other elements. And I love that you can get 2 cards out of one stenciled pattern if you use a big enough piece of cardstock. So using that 7.5-inch square piece of cardstock was perfect because it gave me these 2 equal card panels that fit perfectly on these cards. So that was really fun. And it's a really great way to make multiples of card designs in a really kind of quick and easy way. So thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I can't wait to see you in the next one. To see more of my cards, definitely head over to my Instagram account, which is linked down below, as well as the Penguin Palace Stamps Instagram account, which is also linked down below. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!